On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas. Episode 13, Hidden Paths. Dusty Rhymes stood at the edge of a desolate warehouse district on the outskirts of St. Louis, the sky above him an oppressive shade of gray. The city had long since retreated into the background, replaced by rows of abandoned factories and forgotten buildings, their broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. The scent of rusted metal and oil hung heavy in the air, mixing with the faint odor of decay that seemed to cling to everything in this forsaken part of town. Dusty pulled the collar of his worn leather jacket higher against the cold breeze that whipped through the streets. His breath puffed out in front of him in white clouds, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the cold resolve that had settled deep in his chest. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the knowledge that he was getting closer to Jackson Brown, closer to Mila, and closer to the truth. The sound of gravel crunching beneath his boots was the only noise that broke the eerie silence. Dusty scanned the area, his sharp eyes taking in every detail: the rusted chain-link fence that bordered the abandoned lots, the crumbling walls of the buildings that loomed over him like silent sentinels. This place, once a bustling center of industry, was now little more than a graveyard of forgotten dreams. He had followed the trail here after piecing together information from a series of dead ends and whispered rumors. It had been exhausting work, each lead slipping through his fingers like sand, but he wasn't about to give up, not now. Dusty's jaw clenched as he thought about Mila, about the innocent girl who had been taken from her home and dragged into a world no child should ever have to face. He could feel the clock ticking in the back of his mind, each second a reminder that time was running out. His fingers tightened around the handle of the flashlight in his hand, his other hand instinctively brushing against the holster on his hip. This part of town was dangerous. He knew that going in. But danger had never stopped him before. He had been in worse situations, faced worse men than Jackson Brown. But something about this felt different, darker. He approached the entrance to one of the warehouses, the large metal door hanging slightly off its hinges. Dusty paused for a moment, his breath catching in his throat as he listened for any sounds of movement. The building stood silent, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for him to step inside. The hair on the back of his neck prickled as he reached out and pushed the door open with a creak that echoed through the cavernous space beyond. Dusty slipped inside, the dim light from outside casting long shadows that stretched across the concrete floor. The inside of the warehouse was massive, its high ceilings disappearing into darkness. Broken machinery littered the floor, and the walls were covered in graffiti, layers of messages scrawled by people who had passed through here, each one a mark left behind in a place that no longer cared. Dusty moved quietly, his flashlight cutting through the gloom as he made his way deeper into the building. His eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, searching for any sign that this place was more than just another dead end. The tension in his chest grew tighter with each step, his heart pounding in his ears as he pushed further into the unknown. His mind raced as he thought about the people he had spoken to over the past few days, the reluctant witnesses, the street informants who had hinted at something big going down in this part of town. He had pieced together bits of information about Jackson's operations, about the places he used to hide the girls he trafficked. But so far, every lead had felt like a trap, a diversion meant to throw him off the trail. Dusty stopped in the center of the warehouse, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the floor. The silence pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. Was he wasting time here? Was Mila even alive? He clenched his jaw, pushing the thought away. He couldn't afford to think like that. Not now. Not when he was this close. As he moved toward the far end of the warehouse, something caught his eye. An old rusted door tucked away in the corner. It looked out of place, almost as if it had been forgotten by time itself. Dusty's pulse quickened as he approached it, his flashlight flickering slightly as if the batteries were running low. The door was partially ajar, and Dusty could see a faint light coming from the room beyond. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold metal as he pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the small room on the other side. Dusty stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The room was small, cramped, and filled with old storage crates and boxes. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and dust. But it wasn't the room that caught Dusty's attention. It was the figure huddled in the corner. A man, thin and gaunt, his clothes tattered and dirty, sat on the floor with his back against the wall. His head was bowed, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, as if he were trying to make himself as small as possible. Dusty's heart skipped a beat as he realized who he was looking at. Miles Stoe, the homeless man who had first pointed him in the right direction, the one who had given him the lead on the black van. Dusty's stomach twisted as he took in the man's disheveled appearance. Something was wrong. "Miles?" Dusty called out softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Miles didn't respond. He didn't even look up. His shoulders were hunched, his body trembling as if he were cold, though the air in the room was stagnant and warm. Dusty stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the man's face. That's when Dusty saw it. The blood. A slow, steady trickle of blood ran down Miles's arm, pooling on the floor beneath him. Dusty's heart lurched in his chest as he rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the man. "Miles, what happened?" Dusty asked, his voice urgent as he reached out to check the wound. The man flinched at his touch, his eyes flickering open for the first time. They were wide, filled with fear and pain. "They found me," Miles rasped, his voice barely audible. They knew I talked." Dusty's blood ran cold as he realized what had happened. Jackson's men had gotten to Miles. They had beaten him, maybe worse, and now Miles was paying the price for helping Dusty. Guilt surged through Dusty's chest, tightening like a vice around his heart. "I'm sorry," Dusty said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have protected you." Miles's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting around the room as if he were searching for something. Someone. They're watching. Always watching. Dusty's jaw clenched as he glanced around the room, his senses on high alert. Whoever had done this to Miles could still be nearby. He needed to get him out of here. But first, he had to know one thing. "Miles, did they take Mila?" Dusty asked, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside him. "Is she still alive?" For a moment, Miles didn't respond. His gaze flickered between Dusty and the door, fear etched into every line of his face. But then, slowly, he nodded. "They have her," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "But you're running out of time." Dusty's heart pounded in his chest, the urgency of the situation slamming into him like a freight train. He had been right. Mila was still alive, but for how long? He gently lowered Miles back against the wall, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan. He needed to get Miles to safety, but more than that, he needed to find Mila. And Jackson. The stakes had never been higher, and Dusty knew that the path ahead was dangerous, filled with uncertainty. But there was no turning back now. "Hang in there, Miles," Dusty said quietly, gripping the man's hand for a moment before rising to his feet. "I'm going to get you help." As Dusty turned toward the door, his eyes narrowed with determination, his mind focused on one thing: bringing Mila home. He had found the hidden paths, uncovered the shadows where Jackson operated. Now it was time to confront the man who had taken so much from so many. Dusty's pulse quickened as he stepped out of the warehouse, the cold night air biting at his skin. He was running out of time, but he wasn't running out of hope. And as long as he had hope, he still had a chance.